Old Montreal is a city rich in culture, with tales of triumph, tragedy, and more than a few ghosts. Rue St. Paul has two well-known spirits, each with their own tragic tales of suffering. This is truly a street of tortured souls.
Rue St. Paul in Old Montreal is a perfectly preserved time capsule of New France. Among its shops and beautiful buildings roam two tortured spirits from its violent past. The irony of these two ghosts is that although they never met in life, their eternal torment was brought about by the same evil man. The first is a man named Vallière, who in 1732 was arrested without reason. A scheming neighbor sought his property and conspired to have him falsely accused and convicted, thereby forcing him to forfeit his land. The executioner prided himself on his ability to make anyone confess, regardless of their innocence. But the executioner was not prepared for the strong will of Vallière. Despite endless and brutal torture, the executioner could not break the man. When Vallière could take no more, he summoned his last bit of strength and hung himself on the very chains that imprisoned him. The executioner was enraged. A prisoner's suicide without a confession would be a black mark on his perfect record. To hide his failure, the executioner carried the body outside into an alley off Rue St. Paul and left it. Vallière would be just another victim of street criminals. Since that day, Rue St. Paul has been haunted by a bloody, beaten man proclaiming his innocence. But Vallière is not alone on Rue St. Paul. There is another, perhaps even more tragic ghost. For over 2 centuries, residents and tourists have encountered a beautiful, dark-skinned woman walking the streets bearing a torch. She is believed to be Marie-Joseph Angelique. In death, she is a spirit. In life, she was a slave. Angelique was owned by a wealthy Montreal businessman when she learned she would be sold to an American slave trader. All her life, she had prayed for her freedom, and if she were sold, that dream would be shattered. In a fit of rage, she took revenge on her master by burning down his estate. Unfortunately, the blazing fire swept through Old Montreal, burning over 40 dwellings to the ground. Miraculously, no one died in the fires, but there was a massive loss of property, and the people demanded justice. Angelique was dragged before the same interrogator and executioner as Vallière. In this era, evidence was not required, only a confession extracted by any means necessary. One wonders what sort of man would be ruthless enough to carry out this twisted brand of justice. In fact, this was a man with the most despised job in Montreal. Executioners were forced to conceal their identities with masks. They took great pride in their masks and attire, feeling it added a degree of intimidation and mystery. After days of endless interrogation, Angelique eventually confessed, though few believed she actually committed the crime. Her order of execution was handed down, and the penalty for her crime was as twisted as it was humiliating. Angelique was sentenced to walk the streets with a sign hung from her neck, which read, "Incendiaire," or arsonist, carved from the very wood of her master's burnt home. She was forced to walk the streets, bearing a torch, begging for forgiveness along the way. She was then brought to the gallows and hung. Angelique's body was burnt on a pyre, and her ashes scattered over Rue St. Paul. It is in the very spot where her ashes were strewn that she is still seen walking the streets with her sign and eternal torch. Angelique's suffering was not in vain. Her story echoed through the halls of Parliament as an example of the horrors of slavery and was instrumental in its ultimate abolishment.